Thank you. My name is Harlan Beckley. I am the director of a program called the Shepherd Program on Poverty and Human Capability at Washington. And the first thing I always say when I mention that is that Shepherd is the name of a benefactor and not a metaphor, which is important. Also, I've probably been at this institution longer than anybody that's been at this conference. So it goes back about 38 years. And I had the opportunity in 1985 to have a conference here. I'm a theologian, theological ethicist, on theological ethics. And at that conference, we had a gentleman named Elmer Johnson, who at the time was vice president of General Motors and was a fairly accomplished lawyer at Kirkland and Ellis in Chicago for a long time as well. And he got up at that conference and said, "I don't dare ask a question here. I am just a country lawyer among philosophers and theologians. So here I am, a naive theologian, all among lawyers." And we have a lawyer panel today, this afternoon, and I want to just simply introduce them and let them talk. Cree Johnson is at Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University, and Rich Hynes, University of Virginia. Alan White is now visiting at Tulane Law School and is employed by Valparaiso University School of Law, and Jim Hawkins is at the University of Houston Law Center. So I'll let them speak, and then we'll have some discussion. Thank you.
Can anyone hear me? Okay. All right, so I wanted to echo my colleagues earlier and thank you all for coming. So my paper is fitting. It's Veterans Day, and if you haven't done so, thank a veteran. I technically am a veteran, even though I don't put myself in the same camp as those who've actually served in Iraq or Afghanistan or places like that.
Thank you.
I'm qualified to talk about this topic today because I grew up very poor, unlike most academics. It's not theoretical for me. It's a life that I've actually lived. And so I find it disconcerting to hear some academics talk about what they think the poor do and what they think should happen to the poor. I've served 6 years in the United States Army Reserve. I was the first to do a study on payday lending where I actually got the contracts. I got grant money where we actually took out the payday loans, and my study revealed what these payday loan contracts contained and revealed at that time what payday lenders said they would do to you if you could not pay the loan by the initial due date. I also actually used to represent banks. I worked at a firm in Pittsburgh for 4 years doing Chapter 11 work, representing creditors in Chapter 11 cases. The title of my paper is that Congress fought to protect the troops. Now it's time for the CFPB to protect civilians from payday lending. As most of you in the room know, the Military Lending Act passed in 2006 became effective in 2007. It covers all active duty soldiers and their dependents. It's applicable to all financial institutions, not just non-bank payday lenders, as long as the loan product meets the definition of a payday loan. It caps the APR at 36%, prohibits rollovers, limits the lender's access to the borrower's bank account, makes mandatory arbitration clauses unenforceable. At that time, members of Congress articulated several reasons why the Military Lending Act was necessary, and I assert in the paper that those same arguments could be raised to protect civilians. The first argument was that the payday loan product was predatory. Republicans, and I quote the Republicans in the paper, referred to payday lenders as loan sharks, referred to payday lending as loan sharking. So my assertion is that if the payday loan was predatory then, it's still predatory now. And if it's loan sharking then, it's loan sharking now. And I also assert in the paper that on some level the payday loan product is actually worse now because we've got the proliferation of online payday lenders who offer higher interest rates, who are known for much more predatory practices in terms of raiding people's bank accounts as compared to the brick and mortar payday loan store. The second argument was that payday lenders target civilians, and as many of you already know, Professor Chris Peterson and his colleague wrote a great article exposing the proliferation of payday lending stores around military bases. And so in my paper, I assert, using the research of others, that that the targeting is similar for the civilian population. There are several studies showing that if you are a minority, particularly Latino and African American, you're much more likely to live in close proximity to a payday lender than Caucasian. If you, that payday lenders are concentrated in low to moderate income communities, particularly minority communities. And so my assertion is that the targeting remains in the civilian population. Third, the argument was that the soldiers were lacking in financial sophistication. Well, there's nothing that makes a civilian more sophisticated than a soldier. We do not have mandatory financial literacy education in our public K through 12 system, so that a civilian is equally unprepared to deal with payday lending as the soldier was. The fourth argument was that payday lending interferes with military preparedness. Now, one part of the argument was that members of Congress said that it caused some soldiers to lose their security clearances, or they couldn't obtain security clearances because of the high indebtedness to payday lending. And so I can't make that assertion for civilians. But another aspect of this argument was that it interfered with the soldier's ability to do his or her work, as you can imagine, stressed out from the debt, stressed out from aggressive debt collection practices. And so in my paper, I assert that that's true for the civilian as well. And on some level, it's worse for the civilian. Because unlike the military member who had the commanding officer, top military brass fighting to get them help, such as getting them connected with military relief societies, getting them connected to on-base sources to help them get out of debt, the average civilian does not have an employer fighting to help them deal with payday loan debt. And I report one particular case, and there are anecdotal stories of civilians losing their jobs or falling into disfavor because they've been viewed as deadbeats as a result of debt collection practices. And so on that level, I say that the civilian is interfered in his or her preparedness to do the job. The last argument was that payday lending led to unmanageable debt. And I assert in the paper that this is true for the civilian as well. And I buttress that argument by comparing the social safety net for the soldier to that for the civilian. And I do that by not disparaging the service of the soldier, but simply to say it's a fact that the social safety net for people in the military are strong compared to civilian population. And so by that I mean the soldier enjoys free health care, the soldier enjoys subsidized or free higher education, highly subsidized or free housing, and numerous other benefits that I mentioned in the paper. And so my assertion is that if the soldier with a strong social safety net needed protection from payday lending, then how much more the low to moderate income civilian who has a tattered and torn social safety net. And so let me go back. So the bottom line is this. If the payday loan was bad for Private Ryan, the payday loan is bad for Shaniqua. It has not mysteriously turned into a good product just because the civilian gets the product. Okay, the next part of my paper, I talk about efforts by members of Congress, particularly Luis Gutierrez out of Illinois, Senator Dick Durbin, to try to get legislation passed to offer civilians similar protection to that offered to the soldier. Those efforts have been unsuccessful. Then I move to talking about mainstream financial institutions, and I assert that they alone cannot be trusted to protect civilians or to offer on a large scale affordable low-cost loans. Wells Fargo is one of the major banks involved in this. It's offering their version of payday loans, which they call direct deposit advances. They have triple digit up to quadruple digit interest rates in 26 states. And then my favorite, which I reflect in the paper, is Fifth Third Bank. I've been a customer of Fifth Third Bank for 12 years, and I compare what I learned about their early access program to the typical payday loan. And I say on some level it's the same. It has a short maturity date, single balloon payment. But then I say on some level it's worse than the typical payday loan because as a condition of getting the early access advance, the consumer has to have direct deposit. Which means then, why is this direct deposit in place? It's not for the convenience of the consumer, it's to make it easy for the bank to collect against the consumer. That is to say, because of the automated system, the bank can do an automatic offset as soon as that direct deposit hits the bank account. And so the bank puts itself in the position of getting paid above any other creditor including the consumer's maybe even child support obligation or something as worthy. And I say that these banks, if they're not violating consumer protection laws, they're violating the spirit of those laws by tapping into income sources without due process. So the next part of the paper, I move to the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau under the Dodd-Frank Act. And I talk about how the Consumer Protection Bureau, which is the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren, has broad rulemaking authority, which applies to all financial institutions, not just non-banks. And that the CFPB has exclusive broad authority over payday lenders, non-bank payday lenders, has primary enforcement authority over large financial institutions, which is defined above, and has no enforcement authority over smaller financial institutions, and the majority of banks and credit unions fall into that camp. However, the CFPB does have the ability to talk to prudential regulators and get them to bring enforcement action. And so this paper got extremely long, and so I split it up in the summer, and the whole discussion about the CFPB's rulemaking authority and my vision about how they can make that happen is in a law review article that's going to come out in the Catholic University Law Review. And this paper is, as you know, 60-something pages already, and that's without even adding the footnotes. But Jean Brocker said that I could have some of her 50-page limit, so I don't think I should have to reduce anything in my paper. Okay, so I talk about how the CFPB, what can it do instead of passing a rule or regulations? What can it do to change the supply of the loans that are in the market to consumers? And I say they should follow a three-step strategy. And if Leslie uses any of this, I hope she gives me credit at the CFPB. Okay, so the first step is to issue guidelines identifying the common payday loan practices as deceptive, unfair, or abusive. The second is to issue a policy statement granting a safe harbor to those institutions that offer loan products that meet the criteria of safe, affordable loans. And the third step is to fulfill an educational mandate by connecting consumers to those institutions that are offering low-cost loans. In terms of this three-step process, the first step, I say, is rooted already in the actions of numerous federal and state actors, right? We've got what Congress did when they passed the Military Lending Act, many state lawmakers that have recently passed laws to curb payday lending, as well as prudential regulators of various financial institutions. And so I'm giving you as an example then, in my paper, I separate the payday loan practices into two categories. The first I call debt entrapment practices, which is designed to make sure that the borrower cannot pay the loan by the initial due date and has to either default or has to extend the life of the loan by doing a rollover or something else. And those practices identify as triple-digit interest rates, minimal credit checks, large principal payments, single balloon payments, and short loan due dates. And then I have as the debt treadmill practices, those designed to make sure that the payday lender has a continuing stream of payments from the borrower and that the borrower remains on the hook for the original principal. And this is not by design. Quote from CEO of Cash America, the theory in the business is you got to get that customer in, work to turn him into a repetitive customer, long-term customer, because that's really where the profitability is. And those practices I identify as rollovers, back-to-back loans, rapacious electronic debits, illegal garnishments, and criminal prosecution threats. And that sometimes this treadmill can only be escaped through bankruptcy, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing to use bankruptcy to get off the debt treadmill. So in the paper what I do is I go through every one of these practices and I identify what has happened on a federal or state level. So for example, triple-digit interest rates. Military Lending Act caps the APR at 36%. Several states, 36%. The National Credit Union Association caps 28% for loans issued by federal credit unions. FDIC pilot program had a suggested APR cap of 36%, which every bank participating was able to offer a loan product with an effective interest APR at 36% or less. So what I do then in the papers, I go through each one of these practices and I try to tell you what the actors have done on a federal and state level, and then I turn the practice and I say, okay, the guidelines should warn, for example, usurious interest rates are unfair and deceptive. And so I know I'm going to run out of time, so let me skip and just turn it into, you know, what should the guidelines say? The guidelines should say these things about these practices. Okay? And then in the paper, I also take on the dead treadmill practices, and I say the same thing. And so the guidelines will not have the force of a rule, but they can be considered as persuasive authority. They can be given deference in a court, and especially in some states like Ohio, where the FTC and now the CFPB, in the shoes of the FTC, give deference to guidelines issued. And so that they're important in terms of signaling to the marketplace what products, what practices should be considered unfair, deceptive, or abusive. The second step in the strategy is to issue a policy statement to grant a safety zone for those lenders that are already committed to offering loans that are low cost and affordable for consumers. And I say that they could look to the FTC pilot program, that the CFPB can also look at what I just talked about earlier, what state and federal entities have done to come up with a list of terms and practices that should be considered in the zone of safety. So I give as an example of APR that doesn't violate state law or whatever applicable law is at issue. The maturity date is greater than 90 days, partial payments of at least 4 installments, no prepayment penalties, no rollovers, and several other responsible lending practices. The third step, so the recap, so the guidelines are to say, okay, here's a warning to those of you who are offering practices, loans that have bad practices associated with them. And then the policy statement is saying, hey, you guys that are out there doing the right thing, we want to applaud you and we want to give you a zone of safety so that you don't have to fear enforcement action. And then the third step is for the CFPB to use its educational mandate to connect consumers to those institutions committed to offering safe, affordable loans. So then I break part 3 then into how could the CFPB do this. And I talk about how the CFPB needs to tap into social media. It needs to do what corporate America has already done in terms of a new way of thinking about marketing, a new way of thinking about connecting people to your product. And so I say first, the CFPB should increase the number of fans that it has. It should conduct a consumer-generated advertising test. Those of you young folks in the audience, you remember Democracy or Super Bowl ads, right? Where regular people could do a video, that they should use this sort of way to get people engaged with the CFPB, to think about, to even realize the CFPB exists and what the CFPB could do, that it could use crowdsourcing to then pick the best advertisements, that they can then make sure they've secured ahead of time the commitment of banks and credit unions that are willing to offer the loans that meet the policy statement that I was talking about earlier. And then that they would use connect with the Advertising Council and then use a public service announcement campaign to get the word out so that consumers know there are institutions that are out there. And then we need to take advantage of 21st technology. So for example, we can develop a cell phone app. We can develop a Facebook app so that all the person has to do is type in their zip code. And because the CFPB has already secured the commitment of banks and credit unions in every state willing to offer the loans that meet the criteria that I talked about in the policy statement, then the consumer can right away know, okay, you know, First Credit Union on the corner here, or maybe not on the corner, the payday lenders on the corner, but First Credit Union, a bus ride away, will give me a loan that I can get, and I'll have 6 months to pay it back. It'll only have an APR of 28%, and that we can voluntarily change what's in the marketplace with respect to the supply of affordable loans out there for consumers. I see a card about to come up again. Okay. Okay, so I know I talked very fast. Okay, so and I did that because I wanted to get the big picture out. And so the big picture is that if we think about the CFPB, we already know there are efforts in place to try to make the CFPB be ineffective, right? Reduce its funding, etc. And so if you go back and you look in the paper, I talk about what I learned about the Ad Council and how the Ad Council, the CFPB can invest $30 million and yet get, not $30 million, what was it, $2.5 million, and get back, you know, over $120 million over a 3-year campaign in free advertising. So my assertion is that the CFPB doesn't have to sit back and fear Republicans or fear lobbying efforts of various groups to try to make the CFPB ineffective, that the CFPB has a way to deal with what's going on with this market and to get consumers to think about how do I get connected to a lender that's going to not assume the worst about me, not assume that I deserve triple-digit interest rates, but assume that if I'm given a loan product with a reasonable term period to pay it back, that I get a loan product that allows for installment payments, that I get a loan product where the principal is actually reduced as a result of the installment payments, then we've given consumers a chance to get into a loan product that they can be successful at. And then that the CFPB, in addition to using it the way that I've talked about it, that the CFPB can use its educational mandate to encourage consumers to start saving. Okay, so I'm going to say this last thing in my last couple of minutes here. This idea that, if we do all of this, that consumers will not have access to credit is just not true. If you think about the Military Lending Act as a grand experiment, with the Military Lending Act, what we now know is that payday loans to military borrowers went down dramatically. And banks and credit unions, with the urging of politicians, rose to the occasion and began offering the type of loan products that I'm talking about. And so that the CFPB can have a driving force into reversing this race to the bottom that's happening right now, to reward credit unions and community banks that are committed to offering good loan products, to reward them by promoting them and saying, hey, this is a way for you to give consumers something that they can be successful at, and then that we can use this as a way to get consumers into mainstream banking, good banking. I'm not talking about mainstream banking because I'm not here saying, that banks are good 100%. I'm saying we've got to use the CFPB as a way not to just have a website that hopes people will go there, but that we use the CFPB to connect people to institutions who are already committed to offering the loan products that the consumers need. Okay, so he's giving me the 1-minute sign. So in my 1-minute sign, I tell you my personal story. I grew up in New Orleans, very poor. And we didn't have payday lenders. Thank God we didn't have payday lenders, because my mom is not an educated woman, and I could see her thinking going to this store is going to give us a solution. And so in the absence of payday lending, what happened? What happened was, when the third week of the month came, at the end of the third week, I ate ketchup sandwiches. We ate ketchup sandwiches and mayonnaise sandwiches. And you say, oh, you poor thing. I'd rather eat mayonnaise and ketchup sandwiches and know that we still have a roof over our head, or not worry about a car title lender repossessing my mom's only reliable transportation. I'd rather suffer a little bit in my nutrition than for my mom to have gotten a loan product that would have greatly exacerbated our already paycheck to paycheck living. And so I'm not of the persuasion that easy credit is good for consumers. We need to think about how we can get consumers into good credit, and hopefully the CFPB can take that as their mission to steer consumers in a way of responsible lending practices. Thank you.
All right. So my paper looks for a link between payday lending and signs of financial distress or insolvency. A lot of existing papers do this already. What's new about my paper is that I assert that to the extent that there's a link between the legalization of payday lending and trouble, it should be concentrated in areas where there's payday lending. But you can't, if you're looking for a causal effect, you can't look for a correlation between financial distress and where payday lenders actually locate, because the existence or forecasts of changing economic circumstances may affect where they choose to locate, and so you don't know the direction of causation. So what you want to do is you want to have a proxy variable. Where would they where a proxy for where payday lenders would locate? And fortunately, we have proxy variables. Chris Peterson has shown that payday lenders like to locate near military communities. Others have shown they like to locate in communities with large minority populations or moderate income populations. So that's what I do. I use those as a proxy for where payday lenders would locate and ask, as states legalize payday lending, do signs of financial trouble increase in those communities relative to other communities in that state and relative to similar communities in states that did not change their payday lending laws. I conduct two basic tests. One test, I look at changes in state law, The other test, I looked at a change in federal regulation that should have had a disproportionate effect in some states, not others. Unfortunately, I end up adding to the murk and the mess of the existing literature. I don't find clear results. My results that look at changes in state law offer, I would say, modest support for the beneficial view of payday lending, but the results aren't overly robust, and that's not that I get different results when I look at the change in the federal law. Okay, so good. So I'm looking at a correlation between the legalization of payday lending and insolvency. Insolvency is not the same as welfare, right? It's not the same as consumer welfare. It could be that that payday lending has no effect on insolvency, or more accurately, my proxies for insolvency, such as bankruptcy filings, and still reduces consumer welfare substantially. For example, they could ensnare consumers in a debt trap that costs them hundreds of dollars, but it's not so severe that they would actually file for bankruptcy. Why? Well, bankruptcy costs thousands of dollars to file. Right? By the time you pay the attorneys, by the time you pay the filing fees, and so it may not push it that far. It may not even push you over the edge into bankruptcy. Alternatively, payday lending could increase bankruptcy filings and yet increase welfare. Why? It could be that the overwhelming majority of the users use it to caution those moderate shocks that hit them and actually increase their welfare, and the welfare gains from those individuals may be substantial enough to outweigh those few consumers who don't use the product properly, or who are hit by further unlucky shocks and end up in bankruptcy. But I can't measure welfare directly, so it's a reasonable proxy to start with, and that's where I'm going to go. So, should we expect any link between payday lending and measures of insolvency like bankruptcy, crime? Other people have looked at utility cutoffs, etc. The answer is yes, no, maybe, I don't know, according to theory. Right. So let me just start with the no. And one argument may be, you may have seen some arguments that, payday lending actually is really relatively safe for consumers. I mean, really relatively safe for the lenders. This is usually made in the arguments that they charge too much money, look how safe it is. I put charge-off in quotations because this is not GAAP charge-off. GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, uses a different method for payday loans than for credit cards. What I mean here is just what is the total amount of loans that they extend in a year, and what are the amounts that they charge off as uncollectible. If I use Virginia in 2008, I'll come back in a moment while I'm using old data here. Charge-off rate was about 3.2% for credit card loans, and about 5.5% 3.2 for payday loans in Virginia, according to the Federal Reserve Board. 5.5% for credit card loans. That's misleading because that year, the average payday borrower took out about 8 loans, right? And the real question is, what are the odds that an individual borrower is going to default or become insolvent, right? And if you do it by person, for every about 3 borrowers, for every 3 people who went into a payday loan shop, one of them would write a check that would be returned as uncollected. And for every 4.3 borrowers who went in, one of them would write a check that would have to be charged off as uncollectible. Right? So this is using 2008. Why? Well, Cree already sort of told us why, or somebody told us why, that in 2009 there was a substantial change in Virginia law. What did this do? Well, it limited the number of payday loans that were extended per individual, and it has some fairly dramatic changes in the charge-off rate. Actually, the charge-off rate goes up. Why? Because there's not as many people taking multiple loans, and apparently those are actually safer than the people who borrow just once. But the number of bad checks per borrower stays the same order of magnitude anyway. What's my point here? Not to debate the change in the Virginia law, but merely to suggest that payday borrowers are not financially secure, right? That we might think that there could be some link. I'm not showing a causal link here, but there could be some link. That being said, payday loans, typical payday loan is, $300 and something. You might think that the dollar amounts are still too low to have some sort of causal effect. Most of the existing arguments that suggest a link between payday lending and bankruptcy, other signs of insolvency, either positive or negative, depend on some sort of snowballing argument. So, for example, Darren Morris argues, just access to credit can keep a small problem from becoming a severe problem. The old story of if I have the money to pay for my auto repair, I keep my job, and that prevents it from becoming more severe. On the alternative, we have the debt trap stories, and it snares the consumer to debt trap. It sort of spirals out of control and becomes big problems. So there is an existing literature that tests this. I only have 20 minutes. I'm not going to go over it all. There's some very good studies by people in this room. Some say yes, some say no, some say we don't know. Okay? So what do I do? So I used fixed effects models in county level data. I'll go over what a fixed effects model is in a moment. One set looks at changes in state law. Is either states legalize or prohibit payday lending. And by prohibit, I'm including not just by anything that makes it so you can't extend anything that looks like a payday loan. So a 36% rate cap, I count that as a prohibition. This is somewhat of a crude proxy, right? As Paige points out, there's all sorts of other regulations that exist. Virginia changed its regulation in 2009 in substantial ways. I'm having to ignore a lot of that. Why? So I can create a test. And remember, I'm using military minority populations and also moderate income populations as proxies for where payday lenders are likely to locate, right? Because to the extent there's an effect, they should be concentrated in those communities. All right, so this is a fun graph. I mean, this is a fun slide. Unfortunately, it's not Halloween. Otherwise, I'd say I was trying to scare you. But so this is my basic regression. All right, and I'll just try to describe this in a moment. This regression includes what we call fixed year and fixed county effects. So what I'm doing is I'm asking, I'll look at other variables now, but let's just talk about bankruptcy filing rates. Anything that causes, say, Albemarle County to have a higher filing rate than the city of Charlottesville, you can tell where I'm from, that should be, to the extent that's constant across time, that's accounted for. So any variables that are different in different regions of the country that don't change, I account for that. Any macro shocks that should have a uniform effect across the country, I account for that as well through the fixed time effect. Now, what I'm most interested in are these variables that start with the word payday. And the variable payday is just, was payday lending legal in that state in the prior year? Why do I use a prior year? Because scholarship by Ron Mann and others suggests that it takes a while, once people start to get into financial trouble, before they actually bother to file for bankruptcy, there should be a lagged effect. So that's why I use the prior year. And so the first variable just asks, as states legalize payday lending, do bankruptcies or other variables go up or down in counties in that state? And then the next variable is interaction variables. They ask, well, is that effect larger in areas where we think payday lenders are likely to locate? Is that effect larger in areas with large minority populations, large military populations, large number of individuals in certain income groups? Now, my data goes from 1998 to 2009, right? And there's a huge change in bankruptcy law during that time. The 2005 Bankruptcy Reform Acts immediately, I don't want to make a causal claim here, but I think everyone would agree there probably was causal. Immediately after the enactment of BAF-CEPA, the bankruptcy filing rate dropped 70%. 7-0. Huge change. Right? Now, to some extent, I could argue, well, I've got a fixed year effect, but it could very well be that the effect of the reforms were disproportionate depending on many of the same variables I'm using as my interactions. If the effect might, for example, have had a larger impact on lower income communities. Why? Because BAF-CEPA raised the cost of filing. It's now more expensive to go hire an attorney. So you might think that it should have a larger effect on lower income communities. Now, that may not be right. Elizabeth Warren, for example, did a study where she looked at the income distribution for people who filed for bankruptcy just before the change in law and compared those who filed just after the change in law, and she found no change. So she found no disproportionate effect on lower income groups. Of course, that's not the angle that she stressed in her study. She stressed that there was no effect on the higher income groups, but that might suggest I don't need to control for this, but I'm going to do it anyway, just because I think that there still may be some risk there. All right, so other minor points. I weight by population in 2000, so that I'm not counting Los Angeles County, the same as some counties in this country that have like 10 people. And a cluster by state. My standard errors, don't worry about what that means. Okay, so, let me start with my results. So these results look at as states legalize or prohibit payday lending. And the first regression just asks, do they go up or down in the states that legalize versus states that don't? And the numbers in parentheses are my p-values. What the heck does that mean? It means, how sure are we that this number is different than 0? And actually, it's sort of the inverse of it. If we get to 0, it means there's a 0% chance that this number is going to be 0, right? If it's 81, it means we're only 19% sure that this number is different from 0. In other words, I estimate that actually legalization of payday lending does lead to more bankruptcy filings, but I'm only 19% sure of that estimate. That's not very sure. We just say, we don't say that it's 0. Sometimes economists treat non-statistically significant measurements as zero, but you can't do that. But I don't put any stock in it. It just could be pure chance. What's interesting is as I include, first I just try including just minority populations, and note here I have minority and minority squared. Why? Because the effects may be nonlinear, right? The difference between a community with 1% minority population and 2% may not be the same as 90% and 91%, right? So I allow for nonlinear effects. That's why I include both. But in any case, I estimate that the effects appear to be negative, although there's no stars there. Why? I'm only 89% sure in that regression. Typically, you don't say statistically significant unless it's either 90, 95, or 99% sure. So we're only 89% sure. Economists would say that, we're not going to count that statistically significant, probably because you ran a gazillion regressions and who knows what you're showing me here. All right? But what does seem to be consistently significant in these regressions is the military population. Consistent and negative. Areas as we legalize payday lending, areas with larger military populations, the bankruptcy filings tend to go down. This seems to be supporting the beneficial view of payday lending. I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to skip these. This is just the other controls in those slides in case someone asks a question later. I test other methods to see for robustness, to see if it's just the way I've specified it. I look at the log of the filing rate instead of the filing rate itself. I throw out very large and very small counties. So I throw out counties with less than 1,000 people or with more than 1 million people. Military individuals, it's very unlikely they're going to file for bankruptcy, so I readjust population to try to pull them out. There was a change in law in 2007 to try to limit payday lending to the military. Also, I worry about how I'm controlling for the change in the bankruptcy law. So I just say, gee, I'm going to throw out all of my data after 2005. I'm at 90% significance, so it still seems to be somewhat robust. I remove state trends to see if I'm picking up some sort of underlying trend I can't explain. Seems to be robust to that. And the effect here seems to be concentrated in Chapter 7 versus Chapter 13, different types of bankruptcies, but I've probably got about 3 minutes left, so I'll keep rolling. If I look at the crime rate, so other studies have suggested that we can look at financial distress by looking for changes in crime rate. I don't get the same result for the military. I get consistent results. They're consistent with the beneficial view, and then the signs are the right way, but they're not that robust, right? I got that crime tends to fall in areas after they legalize payday lending. but it doesn't seem to be concentrated in the military communities. Let's see. I'll skip back in time. So that's one study. And I should have stopped there, because then I could have said, gee, look, I'm proving that payday lending is great, and therefore it should be legalized, and therefore the payday lender should give me large grants. But I unfortunately didn't stop. I also decided to look at the end of the rent-a-charter era. So in some states where they had tight usury laws, the payday lenders got around it by partnering with out-of-state banks. Particularly this, I think, was common in Pennsylvania and in North Carolina. And the out-of-state banks would say, we're not bound by your North Carolina usury laws because we're a Delaware, South Dakota, or wherever it was bank. We can, according to the Supreme Court and federal law, we can use our out-of-state usury limits. And the FDIC changes its regs. Jim Hawkins has a nice paper on this, discussing that this effectively era ends by 2006. So I use this as another little test to see effectively what happens in Pennsylvania and North Carolina counties relative to some other counties in control. And the story looks very different. The story, if anything, I would suggest it's more towards the detrimental view, although I don't really get any statistically significant results that are very robust. Here, I've made the signs again so that if the beneficial view is true, they should have negative signs. And if the detrimental view is true, we should have positive signs. It's just not there. Skip over those. Skip over the robustness. Again, just not really there. Perhaps here in one regression, but I'm not going to worry. I mean, 1 out of a gazillion, that is just by chance. With the crime rate, again, I also get a different picture, right, than what I was getting with the bankruptcy filings. So if I just had the bankruptcy filings, I might be able to try to tell a detrimental story. But it looks like here I'm telling a beneficial story with my crime. So I don't know, right? The in the short of this is, I looked at this. I saw literature that was getting conflicting results. I decided let's just try one other test here that I thought I could come up with something. Maybe I can help clarify, and unfortunately, I just contributed to the mud. I should also say thank you for inviting me to the symposium, because you usually don't get to contribute mud.
Okay, how's that work? Good? Oh, no. Okay. Well, I want to echo the sentiments that everybody else has expressed, to thank everybody at Washington and Lee, Jim, and his colleagues in organizing this symposium. This has been terrific, and I really appreciate the opportunity, in particular, to come after all these great papers that ask some of the questions that I hope my paper is somewhat foundational to thinking about. So my paper is really about John Caskey's big question. How do we decide whether small loan credit makes people better off or worse off? And obviously the second implied question... No, that's okay. Yeah, okay, I didn't intend to display it.
It's slides there.
Yeah, I'm just using it for notes. Sometimes I bring slides. I hope you all will forgive me for not having pictures for you today. And so related, obviously, the question of concern to lawyers, right, is can legal regulation do anything to improve the welfare impact of small loan credit? And there is, and John's article is an excellent compilation of many of the studies that have tried to take particular aspects, particular measures of welfare and try and figure out the answer to that question. And so what I hope to contribute with this paper is both a sort of a theoretical contribution and an empirical contribution. The theoretical contribution is to try and ask, well, what counts? What does it mean for credit to make people better off or worse off? What are we talking about? What's our theoretical construct? Because inevitably, when we do these studies, we choose proxies, as the last paper illustrated, and it really matters. I mean, a lot of work goes into measuring, the impact of payday lending on a crime rate or on a bankruptcy filing. But is that really what we want to measure? And if it is, why? So the theoretical piece is really about kind of an idea, a construct of the welfare economics of credit for the poor in particular. And the empirical piece is a discussion about the experience, some international experiences of small loan credit, microcredit, particularly in Bolivia and South Africa, that I think provide two really interesting illustrations of efforts to use changes in a legal scheme, a legal regulatory scheme for credit to make people better off. In fact, deregulation of credit essentially was an intentional development strategy for those two countries, and with very problematic results. And I also talk in the paper about, the original microlending model that evolved first in the Grameen Bank and their work in Bangladesh, and I talk about some of the research that's been done on payday lending. Now, obviously, microcredit and payday loans are not the same thing. But as it turned out in some of the international experiences, they often serve as substitutes. One will evolve into the other. And I think a lot of the lessons about how to differentiate beneficial credit for the poor from harmful credit can be learned from those markets. So the initial concept, and I've been thinking about this paper for several years, and I'm very grateful to this symposium for giving me the opportunity to finish this thing and get it published. My initial concept was, so there's good credit for the people on the left, and I certainly consider myself one of them, who advocate for more access to credit for the poor, and the poor need credit as a development strategy. So we think about microcredit, the loans of the Grameen Bank, as good credit. Then we think about payday loan lending, and that's bad credit. And so what fundamentally differentiates those things? And I found, of course, as has been pointed out numerous times, that the research on both forms of credit is extremely equivocal. Right? There are studies about microcredit in the developing world and payday lending in the United States that say it's harmful, that say it's beneficial, that say we don't know. And so I'm trying to make sense out of all this and think about how we can do research, particularly in an era where hopefully we have this new agency that cares about, data-based and fact-based regulation of credit. So part of the difficulty in reading the different studies has to do with very different premises that they start from. In my view, many of the studies that find that small loan credit, payday loan credit, is beneficial start with a pretty classical normative framework that we use sort of sub rosa in most contemporary economics, which is the utilitarian theory of revealed preferences, right? The idea is that what is good is something that maximizes the utility of everyone in society. Those of you who study a little philosophy know that there have been critiques of utilitarianism since it was invented in the 19th century, and even going back to Aristotle and Plato. But even assuming that we're in the world of utilitarianism, when we say laws and rules and norms should be about maximizing utility, you still have to ask the question, well, how do we determine what makes more, what is the greatest good for the greatest number? And revealed preferences is a very specific approach to that, invented essentially by Paul Samuelson in the 1930s and 40s. I think the original paper was in the 1930s. And the idea of revealed preferences was to say, well, we don't want to make comparisons between different individuals. Is it better to make a poor person better off? Does that count more than making a rich person worse off? And so the idea is we'll measure utility by looking at actual transactions that people voluntarily engage in. And if two people engage in a market transaction, then they have revealed the fact that the benefit they get from that transaction exceeds the cost to them. That they prefer the state with the transaction than the state without the transaction. The difficulty with using revealed preferences and it has all sorts of corollaries that I'm not going to go into, but it underlies, really, the notion of revealed preference utilitarianism really underlies most contemporary law and economics theory. And it creates difficulties when you try and apply it to the sphere of consumer credit. Because if we say that any transaction that two parties enter into voluntarily makes them both better off by definition, then you pretty much ended the analysis, right? There is really no room for regulation. Any small loan transaction, credit transaction, must make the borrower better off because the borrower, by engaging in that transaction, assuming no information problems, and so maybe all we have to do is solve the information problems, by definition, they're better off, the lender's better off, everybody's better off. That conception runs up against a lot of our fundamental intuitions, the intuitions that Professor Peterson talked about that are reflected in these moral values about credit that go back to, Hammurabi and biblical times. And there's a reason for that. Revealed preferences and utilitarianism have their limitations. One of the problems in this particular context, it seems to me, with revealed preferences is people's preferences are both unstable, inconstant, and subject to manipulation. And there's a lot of good research that demonstrates this. So somebody might prefer to take out a payday loan because they want to get their car fixed today, but on deeper reflection next week or next month when the payment becomes due, they may value the trade-offs between the interest cost and the advancement of funds in a very different way. In the same way that we have different preferences and even inconsistent preferences about whether we want to eat the ice cream that's in the freezer, or maybe we should just put a lock on the freezer so we can resist temptation. Right? Behaviorists have told us lots of things about preferences that undermine revealed preferences as a way of thinking about maximizing utility. And of course, there's the fundamental problem of ignoring distribution and distributional impacts with credit, because revealed preferences kind of assumes away the problem that some people start out with more money than others. And one of the moral, ethical objections to lending to the poor is that you are redistributing income from the poor to the rich, essentially, through the mechanism of interest. And so the theoretical ground that I turn to for how to think about harms and benefits. So we could say with revealed preferences, we should just let the market decide. We know, we have intuitions that there are harms that are caused to people by, it appears, some credit products. So how can we evaluate, how can we measure and study the benefits and the harms if the benefits and harms aren't determined simply by revealed preferences? And that's where I turn to the work of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum and their conception of welfare economics, which is a much more complex and sort of a pluralistic view. But they start with this concept they call human capabilities. The idea that wealth maximization is not what it's all about. Wealth is just a means to an end, and the end is the development of human capabilities. And they identify those capabilities. And right now I'm just working on Martha Nussbaum's new book that sort of summarizes this idea. And I was struck very much by the fact that early on in the book she uses an example of microcredit as something that furthers the development of human capabilities. Let me just read to you what she says about this particular woman in India who has obtained a small loan. She says, in this story we can see access to credit is a fertile capability. Meaning it helps to promote more than one human capability at the same time. The loan enabled her to protect her bodily integrity. She was able to basically leave an abusive partner and avoid domestic violence. It enabled her to have employment options. She used it for entrepreneurial purposes. To participate in politics, to have a sense of emotional well-being, to form valuable affiliations with others. And it goes on in this tone in a way that makes credit sound like, the magic bullet for human development. And I mean, there's something really genuine going on there. And I know from my own experience in working with poor people as a legal aid lawyer that access to credit is something that can be seen as extremely beneficial. On the other hand, we know that there are both economic and non-economic harms that are caused by debt and debt default. So what I try to do here, and it seems to me a lot of the studies that are done about both microlending and payday lending, they focus on either a benefit, and I'll talk about the benefits of credit, like the ones that Professor Nussbaum talks about, or they focus on a harm, and they want to study, do payday loans, for example, cause this particular benefit, or do they cause this particular harm? But the much more complex and rich question to me, it seems, is to try and think about the benefits and harms in some more global and collective way. And to, it's very helpful to have this research that focuses on particular consequences, but in the end we have to have some theory for trying to measure them both and maybe make some trade-offs. And so typically regulation advocates are going to focus on default costs and just the interest costs. I mean, those are sort of the two fundamental harms. That the prices are very high and that the consequences of default, and the default rates are quite high. I think the 25% we heard about from Professor Hynes is typical. I think Page's data shows sometimes it's 50%. Many of these small loans have bad outcomes. Those are kind of the two most problematic features. And there are a lot of harms in terms of psychological costs, social exclusion, and so on that flow from those costs. Market advocates typically more tend to talk about the benefits that are derived from getting the money from the loan and getting it sooner. And those are undeniable. And they clearly have power for the people who are taking out these loans. So let me talk about some of the examples of research that has been done. I think one of the best and most interesting is a study that Esther Duflo and her colleagues at the MIT Poverty Action Lab did in India, where they actually had a pure experimental design, right? I don't know if any of you are familiar with this study, but they actually were able to randomly give small loans to some people and not others who were otherwise the same kind of people. Right? They just had the money to do this, and they went to a town in India, and some people got microloans and some didn't. And then they tried to measure not whether they had access to credit or whether they had more money temporarily, which is sort of tautological, but what was the impact on their family education, on their ability to invest in durable goods, on their health status. And unfortunately, as with many of the studies, the results are a little muddy. Right? There wasn't really a dramatic impact on well-being. It seemed that people who had more kind of motivation, entrepreneurial skill to begin with were better off by having access to credit. Other people were indebted and they were not better off. So it's a real challenge to try and think meaningfully about the benefits and harms of credit and to weigh them. Now, it seems to me there are some starting points that are maybe obvious, but that we should think about. So getting access to credit, the benefit of credit is not the amount of the credit, right? It's the shifting in time of the consumption that represents. And since there's inevitably a cost, apart from free loans that are occasionally made through charitable associations, there has to be a benefit from that time shifting in consumption that offsets the cost that the borrower is going to pay. And so microlending is for entrepreneurial purposes is the simplest example because there the idea is that borrowed money is going to be invested in income-producing activity. So if the loan is used to produce more income, then you have a simple, obvious economic benefit. You can also show that people will sometimes save by consuming durable goods that save them costs in other ways. And the story of using a payday loan for an emergency is one that has to do with saving costs, right? I get my car fixed so I won't lose my job and have a huge cost of having no employment income for some amount of time. But loans also can just be about consumption smoothing. And if we depart from the idea of revealed preferences and we look at the actual impact of consumption smoothing on a family, that's much harder to measure, right? If you take out a payday loan, to use Cree's example, to avoid having to eat your mayonnaise sandwiches for 3 more days, and you're paying, $20 to get that $100 loan, is the ability to consume at a slightly higher level for 3 days worth $20? That's a very difficult question to ask, it seems to me. And on the cost side, I think we can quantify probably more easily what the costs of small loan lending are. Apart from the payment of interest and default risks, there's a lot of evidence about sort of the stress, the psychological cost, and the other consequences of over-indebtedness, and I cite a lot of that research in my paper as well. So then the question is, if we're trying to think about how credit enhances people's ability to have food, shelter, political participation, education, the human capabilities that we value, where do we start in thinking about regulating credit markets? So it seems to me there are some possibilities that suggest themselves to an agency like the CFPB. First of all, the cost of credit itself is not something that we systematically measure, tabulate, and report on. Right now, the Federal Reserve has, one or two data points they tell us about how much people pay to borrow money, for a mortgage, for a car loan. But we don't really have very good granular information. Even, let's say, about the payday lending industry. What are the interest rates, and what are the costs people actually pay as the products are actually used? That, it seems to me, worth measuring when we think about what the possible benefits might be, because the benefits of the credit might be a lot different if it turns out that it's available at relatively lower prices, and conversely, we might put a much higher burden on the industry to justify products if we can see that the prices are consistently quite high. I think we need a lot more information on the economic and social impact of credit default. Right? So using bankruptcy, for example, and insolvency as a proxy for harm, that to me raises other questions. Is the fact that somebody files bankruptcy in and of itself evidence of harm? I think there is certainly some good evidence on the exclusion effects and the psychological costs of bankruptcy. But with payday loans in particular, it strikes me, given that many payday loan borrowers default and don't file bankruptcy, it's less clear what exactly the harms are of people getting the loans and not repaying them. But that's, I don't want to be agnostic, but I don't have an a priori about that. It may be extremely detrimental or harmful, or it may be that it's part of a strategy that people use in making decisions about the trade-offs. I think we need to understand more about consumption smoothing and dealing with emergencies. The evidence, I think, from the Survey of Consumer Finances and elsewhere is that payday loans are mostly just used for ordinary consumption, to pay bills, to buy groceries, but they also have this use for emergencies that I think some of the borrowers value quite highly. And if we could disaggregate that and see what the actual uses of these loans are and how those uses differentially may benefit people or not, that information would be really useful to have. So I don't have time to tell you about the experiences of Bolivia and South Africa in the paper, but short version of that story is that both countries liberalized credit and had huge over-indebtedness crises, and the response has been to re-regulate. In both countries, they adopted certain principles of regulating but not banning small loan credit for the poor. And there is some consistency about what they've done and what has been done to make credit more likely to benefit people and less likely to harm them. And a couple of things that I point out in the paper. One is to require amortization, right? Not a new idea, one that's obviously part of a lot of the legislation around payday, but it seems to be very critical in all these contexts. Another is to think about default insurance. So people who default are particularly harmed by their interaction with credit. To think about ways of providing insurance against the default itself or against the events that cause the default. Credit insurance got a very bad rap in this country a few years ago, but it has a real value in maximizing the potential benefit of credit. And all these countries have adopted responsible lending rules like the one that we now have in the United States for mortgages, that loans should not be made if they can't be repaid. That seems like a kind of a no-brainer, but a pretty straightforward approach to trying to maximize benefit and minimize harm. Okay, my time's up. Thank you.
Well, let me add to the chorus of voices saying thank you to the law review for hosting this, and especially I'm thankful for everyone for staying past 4 o'clock. That I was thinking, I'm getting tired and I'm about to talk. I can't imagine what you guys are suffering, and will in about 10 minutes be suffering even worse from tiredness. But my paper today is about auto title lending, which, if you're not familiar with the product, typically how they work is they're 30-day loans, so they're longer than payday loans. They're for high interest rates, around 200%, so they're lower than payday loans, but still high. And the thing that's unique about them is people use their paid-off car as collateral for the loan. And the amounts, it's hard to figure out exactly an average amount for the title loan, but it seems like lenders lend about half the value of your car, and it works out to around $750 for the average title loan. Like basically everything else we've talked about, these generate significant controversy. It's like one step more dangerous than payday loans because not only do you have to pay a lot, but you potentially could lose what might be your most valuable asset. And so I started looking at this because as I heard people talk about it and as I saw legislation being passed and the rationales, I realized that a lot of the things people were saying about title lending, there wasn't really data behind it. And so there's been a couple, Todd Zwicky, who was here yesterday, has a paper that presents a lot of data, and Natalie Martin has a paper that's coming out that has some really interesting data from New Mexico. But a lot of the key questions we don't really have answers to about how these loans work. And so what I wanted to do today was talk about how I tried to get answers to some of these questions and what I thought were the interesting results of what I found. And trust me, I use the word interesting really broadly. My threshold for interesting is really low on this topic. So I apologize in advance if these things seem not interesting to you. And as I go, I'll sort of make some comments about what I think this research suggests for our policy goals. So my approach to obtaining information about title lending, the first thing I did is I tried to get information from states that license title lenders. And so a lot of states require title lenders to send information every year, and then the states produce reports. And so Natalie's paper looks at New Mexico's reports in extreme detail. And other papers have looked at Tennessee does the best report. And so papers have looked at that. And so in addition to Tennessee, I got reports from 5 other state regulators. And so I report the data that they provided, and I got that through a FOIA request and mostly just through me like trying to sweet talk the regulator on the phone into emailing me their report. And so I think some of that's interesting information because it gives us a bigger picture from an entire state. The other thing I did that I was surprised hadn't been done much is I tried to look at public filings by title lenders. And so there's a couple public companies that do title lending, so I tried to find their annual reports. And then fortunately for me, not so great for them, TitleMax declared bankruptcy. They're one of the big title lenders. And so they had to file a bunch of things describing their business, and so I was able to pull information from them. The other thing I did was I tried to interview title lenders at a variety of different levels. So I interviewed people at big public companies, at big private title lending companies, and then some small operators who just had 2 to 10 stores in Texas. My most ambitious project was my biggest failure, which was trying to survey people as they came out of title lending stores in Houston. And so I had RAs spend 50 hours in their cars in the sun in Houston over the summer waiting outside title lending stores. And then when someone would come out, they would approach them, and this was all approved through our IRB, and they'd explain what they were doing. And they had a high response rate. 86% or so of people agreed to do the survey. But it only, after 50 hours of them waiting outside, only 36 people completed a survey. And so I'll report that data just because it was painful for them to obtain. But I'm not claiming, this represents title lenders across the universe or even in Texas or Houston. It only represents these 36 people. But my hope is to reproduce this study using some sort of better strategy. And so I'm looking forward to feedback on the questions I asked. And if we may have time in the question time, but if you send me comments, I hope to reproduce this study to get some more data. So, the things that I thought were interesting from these different research strategies. The first is the question that we've talked about a couple times, is why do people use these high-cost, high-risk loans? And, we've heard the two different views. Lenders say they use them for emergencies. Opponents say they use them just for routine expenses. And I've never seen anything where title lenders, no data about why title lending customers use the loans. The FDIC has this one on payday loans, but Table 1 in my paper reports the results from a survey that one of the big three private title lenders did of 1,500 or so customers across 5 states. And if you look at that table, it doesn't really tell you whether or not people use them for emergency purposes or routine purposes, because the reasons sort of seem like both. Some people say I did it to repair my car, some people said I did it to pay rent, and so there's sort of mixed results. What I thought was more interesting about why people use the loans are the number of people who use them for business reasons. And so Todd Zwicky had suggested in his paper that he estimated 30% of people use these loans for business loans. But he doesn't provide the data about which lenders told him that or how he came to that estimation. So I wanted to try to figure out for myself. And what lenders told me was roughly corresponded with what he said. Lenders in Texas said, 10% of our loans, people say they're using them for their small business. Other people said 30%. And just to give you a context of how people might use it for a small business, there's this one lender in Texas who told me they had this same guy came back over and over again who had paid off his pickup truck. And so he would come, take out a title loan on his pickup truck, and use the money to buy a bunch of furniture that he loaded in the back of the truck and drove to a highway where he sold the furniture from the side of the highway over the weekend. And he did this over and over again and was able to, by selling the furniture, make enough to pay off the loan and presumably to make some profit to keep doing it. And so all of this is just to... So I also, I guess, asked the people who we surveyed, are you using this just for personal expenses, or is there some sort of business expense? And obviously the number is incredibly small, but about a quarter of the people said that in part at least they were using these loans for some sort of business, some sort of small business, not gas to get to work, but some sort of business that they were running. And actually, it's interesting because the title lending company that did the survey in Table 1 also asked people, what's your job? And about 20% of the people they surveyed said they were self-employed. And think of how different this is from payday loans. I assume the number for payday loans would be 0, right? Because you have to show a payday coming in from somebody else. But auto title loans are different because you don't have to have a paycheck coming in, so people can be running a business with this sort of loan. So what does this suggest to me from a regulatory standpoint? My main suggestion is just, even if you hate auto title loans generally, or like George Washington, oppose them, you should still think, do we want to oppose them for businesses? Because as Alan just pointed out, sometimes loans can result in a productive use of that money. And so if people are able to get the tile they need to do their bathroom renovation for a client and immediately pay back the loan 10 days later when they get paid from the client, maybe that's not something we want to ban. So even if you want to ban title lending, one approach would be to carve out business uses. And this, we have 1 million consumers protection statutes that do exactly that, so it's not a revolutionary idea. But to me, it's something that people opposing title loans completely should consider. So the second thing that seemed interesting to me is looking at what were the risks that borrowers face when they take out a title loan. And obviously the biggest risk is that you'll lose your car. And this is significant, and past research has indicated that the risk is really high. So there's Jean Ann Fox has a 2007 law review article that says 35 to 50% of people have their car repossessed. And the Woodstock Institute in Illinois did a study where they said 18% of people. And Natalie's paper with her co-author says somewhere between 20 and 70% of New Mexican borrowers lose their car. So I wanted to try to evaluate, to see what data I could get on those loans. The paper tries to explain why I don't think those numbers are reliable, but it's kind of not fair because Natalie's paper isn't even public yet. So I could say that she got her number by reading tea leaves or something, and that you have no way to evaluate that. So you should look. Her paper now does a great job of responding to my criticism, so you should just look at both of them. But what I found in talking to lenders, they might be lying, of course, and so I'm not taking these numbers at face value, but lenders say, two of the big three private title lenders, which make up the vast majority of the market, said they track by customer how many people lose their car. And one said 7% of people lose their car, another said 5 to 6%, and the small operators I talked to in Texas reported similar numbers. One said 10%, one said 3 to 4%. But the sort of more wide-scale data is in Table 2 of the paper, which reports from the 6 different state regulatory bodies their repossession rates. And they range, in Oregon, for some reason, there's extremely low repossession rates of, close to 0%. To Tennessee, 1 year had 13% repossession rate. So to me, all of this just suggests if people have relied on high repossession rates as a basis for banning auto title loans, it's important to rethink that in light of this more comprehensive look at the data. That some states at least report lower rates than we would have thought based on past scholarship. But on the other hand, it's not zero unless you're in Oregon. And so there's still a risk. 10% is a significant number of people losing their cars. And so one regulatory suggestion I make is that states should work to try to minimize the effect of those repossessions. So they should require that lenders return surpluses. So if you sell the car and make $2,000 from your sale after the costs of lending, you should have to return that to the customer. And that's what the Uniform Commercial Code generally requires. But in Alabama today, you don't have to return surpluses because title loans are regulated as pawn loans. And so to me, that's a perverse outcome. And I know it's a bad mistake to say Uniform Commercial Code, because if you weren't asleep before, that definitely is like the nail in the coffin of the talk. But I have to say it again, in some states, lenders can pursue deficiencies under the Uniform Commercial Code. So that in Texas, for instance, you can, if you repossess the car and the sale doesn't generate enough income to pay off the loan and the costs, you can sue the person personally and make them declare bankruptcy or garnish their wage or do whatever your state allows to try to recoup the money. And so one regulatory suggestion is to try to prevent that. I think states should all require surpluses be returned and forbid lenders from pursuing deficiencies. So the other risk that's often talked about in people losing their car is that people will lose their only way to get to work or their only way to get their child to the doctor or something like that. And so I started trying to figure out what data we have that suggests that's true. Like how many people are losing their only way to work? And it turns out I'd be curious if anyone has seen data, but I couldn't find anything. There's one study by TitleMax that says 70% of their customers have 2 cars. So for 70% of the people, even if they lose 1 car, they don't lose all of their means of transportation. And that was made, those statements have been made in public filings that they're swearing to. But it's still, without the data, it's hard to trust, right? What a lender would say. So I asked customers, considering just the people living in your same house, how many cars does your family have? And 20% of the people said we just have 1 car. The other 80%, though, said we had 2 or more. And so the modal number of cars people had was 2. So to me, it just raises the issue that it's impossible to overstate how important this lose your way to work argument against title loan is. Like if you look at any governor outlawing title loans, that's what they say. Like in every press release, that's what they say. And so to me, just if we're going to make that claim, it would be nice to have more data to back it up than just, obviously it's intuitively horrible to think of people losing their only way to work. But just based on, my really small survey, I wonder how true it is. So the third thing that I thought was interesting as I did this study was what effect price competition has in title lending markets. Because the standard thinking in payday lending markets is that price is not a point of competition at all. That people, and I think people across the board, say that payday lenders charge the maximum legal rate or something really high and there's not much divergence. And so I was surprised when I looked around Texas how many differences there were in how much title lenders charge. And so just driving around like my neighborhood, some people charge 200%, some people charge 150%, some people charge 100%. And in their advertising, if you go to the websites of some of the people referenced in the paper, they'll say, we're cheap, we're 50% cheaper than our competitors. And they'll one website even lays out their competitors' prices and how much it would cost you to take out their loan versus the loan of the company advertising. And so it seems like in this market, there's much more price competition. And in Tennessee, the regulator got people to report what their interest rate was, and 50% charged the maximum rate allowed by Tennessee law, but almost half, 47% of people charged something less than the maximum rate, somewhere between 10 and 22% a month instead of 22% a month. And so to me, it's just interesting that, and so from a regulatory standpoint, I wondered if some sort of prominent price disclosure might have more effect in this market, that we might think we could make this market better off and drive down prices by making it clearer to people how much these loans cost. Like maybe if we're not willing to say predatory lender on the sign, you could make them say $20 for every $100 borrowed or whatever, so that people just driving by could decide if they wanted to go with that lender. The final thing I wanted to talk about briefly is just how well do people understand the transaction. And so specifically, I was trying to figure out if people were overly optimistic when they took out title loans, but how often they'd roll over the loan, how likely it was that the lender would come and repossess their car. And the way that social scientists always do the optimism, or one way they do it, is they ask how likely it is this bad thing going to happen to you? And then they compare what the people say to what actually happens to people in that situation. And so I asked people who are just taking out the loan that day, how many months do you anticipate it taking you to completely pay off this loan after all renewals and rollovers? And so among people who were taking out the loan that day, 33% predicted taking just 1 month to take out the loan, 28% said 2 months, 22% said 3 months. And we can stop there. It should give us the picture. Most people think that the average length of a title loan is something more like 5 or 6 months. It depends on what data you believe. But not many people think that in general people pay them off after a month. So it would be interesting if this could be replicated on a wider scale. So right now I just can say these 36 people were overly optimistic about how many rollovers. But if it were true that people generally were overly optimistic, then you'd have a great case for if you wanted to ban the transaction because of that consumer error, or at least for having a disclosure that says, people like you roll over these loans 6 times. So this thing's going to cost you $1,000 before the end. So I also asked, what do you think's the percentage chance the lender will repossess your vehicle? And for people taking out the loan the day that they were surveyed, 3/4 of them thought there was a 0% chance that their loan would be taken away. And Texas is not as nice as Oregon, so I know the repossession rate, even though I don't know it, I know it's higher than 0%. So it seemed that most of these 36 people were overly optimistic about the chance that they would lose their car. And title lenders said to me, of course it's 0%. Who would take out a loan thinking they would lose their car? But to me that suggests that people are acting, not in a completely rational way. And so it could be a good chance for regulators to correct the market. So thanks a lot. Look forward to questions.
We have some time for questions, and I'm looking at you.
Okay, thank you so much for writing this paper. I think it is so great, and I really think it adds a lot to the literature. And I'm glad that you took me on too, because I think if it's wrong, it's wrong, Now, so one thing that is just a very quick comment about how there is more variation in the pricing, and we actually found the same thing, that unlike with payday loans where basically everyone's charging, about the same, there actually is a variation. So I'm a little bit, hopeful that maybe people actually are shopping around for the title loans. I thought the one thing that I did want to question just a little bit was this idea of the more than one car. And we could actually do it as an empirical study here, but I'll just pose what I think the slight problem might be there. I don't think very many people have more cars than they have people who need to use those cars. They may have more than one car. But so that's kind of a problem I'm seeing. I know in my household, and I have a very middle income household, I'm married to a teacher, we have 2 cars, and we go in opposite directions, and we need them both. And so I would think that would be pretty common for most middle class people that just have enough cars for the people in their household who need them. And then as you go down into the lower economic situation, I think it's probably less than one car per person. So they may have 2 cars, but I think they probably need the cars. That's just one.
Yeah, I think it's a great, and I wish there was, I don't know how to ask the question to get at that. Because, would it be bad if you lost the car? Because obviously it's always bad. But it's just, if you have to drive half an hour out of the way, that's a cost, but it's not devastating. If you have to drive 2 hours extra or something every day, that's a pretty devastating loss. And so I don't know how to get at, other than just saying how many cars do you have. I don't know
How many people need to use the car?
Oh,
So
how
if
many-
you have 3 people in the home and only 2 cars.
My question is for Rich. Is it possible to go back to your regression table, or is that too much trouble?
I don't know.
I can just ask my question without it then. I guess I just wanted to ask a couple questions about the interpretation of the sort of military coefficient.
Okay.
So I have a couple questions. One is there was a military squared.
Yes.
And the coefficient on
Yes.
military squared is positive and
Yes.
significant.
Yes.
And so it seems like if you put those two together,
Yes.
at ranges above like 25%, so you're getting a positive.
Yeah, so at some point it will turn positive.
Yeah.
That point is where there's one county in the country.
So there's only one county that's above.
I think there's one, so over all the range of observed counties, except I think when I have to go back and check my paper, that it's still negative.
And my next question is, you said that in payday loan areas, it lowers, in payday military areas, it lowers the rate of bankruptcy filing. But wouldn't we also need to add in the main effect of payday?
Yes, you do.
So you've shown that it's significantly less than in other areas, but it still looks like, at least the point estimate is still positive.
Yeah, so the point I don't want to actually say there's a causal effect. So my estimate of the correlation, why do I want to say causal? Because that's not robust, right? But my estimates, if I take the point estimate and add in the and take the estimate on payday times military and take the estimate times payday times military squared, for my observed regions, I get negative. Except for extremely low.
Even when you add, okay, well, I'll take your word. Okay. And then the last thing is, I think you might need, it would be easier to interpret if you had the non-interactive military trend. So military not interactive with payday. And then there might be a trend in bankruptcy filing.
So just have a separate variable for military?
Yeah.
Oh, I can't, sorry. The military data I only get or at the census. I don't get year by year, so it doesn't change across time. So it would blow up my fixed county tax. So I only have the minority and military for 2,000 in the middle of the whole thing. So it doesn't change across time.
Okay, so it's just coming from region effects. Oh.
Yeah.
Did you factor at all the military relief societies and their impact? Because if you're giving people interest-free loans to pay off the payday loan, then they don't have to file bankruptcy, but it's not legalized payday lending that needs to drop in bankruptcy filing. It's the fact that you have other resources for the military person to get out of the payday loan.
So, right. So one of the concerns was that, gee, am I picking up that just military individuals are unlikely to file, and that because of either relief organizations or perhaps there's I think one of the reasons why the payday lenders like to target the military was that there were very severe career sanctions for them if they would file for bankruptcy, and so they were a very good credit risk. And so that's why I was concerned that I might be biasing this. Well, while payday lending, but I didn't really want to study the effect of payday lending on the military. I was just using military as a proxy for where they're likely to locate. And so I tried to factor in that by backing out the military population from one of the robustness regressions, effectively assuming I'm going to adjust the population size to be the non-military population size, effectively assuming that nobody in the military can file for bankruptcy, either because of career or because of those reliefs, and I still found robust results. I'm not sure I fully believe the results, mind you, but it stood up to that change.
I have a question back up here earlier. Maybe it's disappeared.
So I have a question for Jim. So in Virginia, our title lending is a little bit different, and it was before our law change last year than sort of the month-to-month loan model. We had an open-end credit model to get around the Military Lending Act, so it's structured like a 300% credit card. So it's a little bit differently structured than the average title loan across. But in terms of repossession, obviously you're only using the data in here from October 2010 to December 2010 because that's when they were actually regulated. But in our deregulated environment, before October 1st of 2010, we did a study in terms of repossessions from the DMV in Virginia, which was really hard to actually get that data, but actually took like an act of the governor or something to get the data. But a lot of times people, when they get, have you taken into account, I mean, yes, the lenders will probably say 7 to 10% or something in that range in terms of repossessions, but that's a car that's permanently repossessed. It's not like sort of the total number of cars that are repossessed and then the person finds monies or whatever to purchase back the car. I mean, in our experience, we have lots of borrowers who actually, the car gets repossessed, but it doesn't stay repossessed. They figure out, they like borrow from their church, they borrow from family and friends, they beg and borrow because they feel like they really need their car. They're like, I can't lose my car. So they do whatever it takes to go. Sometimes they'll get, some title lenders have told them, well, get a payday loan to get the car, maybe it's a little complicated there, but I mean, we have some borrowers who get it repossessed several times and then buy it back several times. So I don't know if that takes into account those.
I counted all. It's a good point. I counted all people like that as not having had their car repossessed. So these numbers are only people who permanently lost their car. Because to me, that seemed like the real harm or whatever risk that we're avoiding. If somebody loses it for a week, obviously it's really expensive, but it's not a cost that's, it doesn't seem like a cost that people are concerned about when they're trying to outlaw entitlements. But I'd be curious to
We
hear.
took that into account, I think, when we were developing our law, mainly because, it's about an extra $1,000 to buy back your car every time. So if you add that onto the cost of that person, every time they need to buy back their car.
Yeah, I think that's a great, and I guess I sort of think of cost as a separate objection to title loans, and it seems like a really good one, right, because they're really expensive. But I tried to disaggregate that from repossession as a separate basis for regulating them. But yeah, it is a good point that people who get it back still pay more money.
I know you want to ask a question. Is this a follow-up, Jay?
Yes.
Okay, if it's a follow-up, why don't you go ahead?
Actually, repossessing the car is an important thing. It's a power thing that the lender has control of your car and can take the car They don't like to take the car, but they sure do love to use that power. And that's what makes this such an unequal relationship. But what I was going to follow up on is we did get those DMV numbers. We never were quite sure if they were accurate. What we did was get numbers, how many people got loans on the car that were not purchase money loans. And then we backed out how many repossessions there were for the car title lenders. And what we found was a remarkable difference. That, well, first of all, we didn't understand that the biggest car dealers, the biggest car title lenders in the state by far are the credit unions. But they don't charge huge percentages. They do like 90-some% of the car title lending. But what's interesting is to compare their repossession rates to the car title lenders, and you find this huge difference. And I wondered if you might want to try to do that.
I guess it's interesting because all car title lenders say they don't like repossessing the cars precisely because they're expensive for them too. And so even people who, report numbers that include people getting it back still only report 10% or 15% of cars overall. But it makes sense that if you can borrow from a credit union, you're not very smart if you go to a title. Or you're better off, obviously, it seems like in every way, to stay with the credit union.
Several more questions.
I wanted to ask a question really to anyone on the panel who might like to answer, which is about over-optimism, which I think came up a few times. And the example that has affected me a lot in thinking about this is, I know some of you may have the same experience, but we recently changed in our law school to the university's teacher course evaluation form, and there's a question on there about what grade you expect to get in this class, and it turns out that our first-year students all think they're going to get A's. And we have a curve, which is published in the student handbook, and they're not all going to get A's. And so that's outside the debtor-creditor realm, right? But what I'm wondering is it different in the debtor-creditor realm? Is it just a common human phenomenon when you do something you think you're going to have a good outcome? Does it matter that it's debtor-creditor? I mean, would we expect that most people would think they'd be successful? And so what do we make of data like this, that people are over-optimistic?
So I think it matters, and I think it matters because you need to be much more specific about the nature of the over-optimism to make it a coherent theory. In fact, so I like to think of there's two different things I can be over-optimistic about. I can be over-optimistic in the sense that I underestimate a very, very severe event that could hit me, in which case I can't pay back any of my debts. Or I could be over-optimistic in the sense that I underestimate moderate shocks that make it painful for me to take out this precise additional debt. Right? To the extent that I'm over-optimistic about the former, that doesn't actually cause me to borrow too much. It causes me to borrow too little. Why? Because what I'm doing is I'm overestimating the odds I'm actually going to pay this debt back. If a severe shock hits me and I'm not going to repay my debts, it doesn't matter if I borrow more right now, I'm not going to pay. It's free money. So if I'm overestimating the odds, if I'm over-optimistic, it means I'm going to in that sense, I'm overestimating the chance I'm going to repay my debts. I'm overestimating the importance of the interest rate, so I'm borrowing too little. It's only if I'm over-optimistic about moderately severe events that make it painful. I'm still repaying the debt, mind you, but it's just painful to repay the debt. Or perhaps maybe if there's a fixed cost of filing for bankruptcy or for enduring shocks, if that is just enough to push me into insolvency. It's only that type of over-optimism that causes me to borrow too much, not the other, and we need a lot more data about what is it that people are being over-optimistic about. That's another thing.
Anybody else want to respond?
I was just kind of briefly that I think it's very contextual in terms of the demographics and the culture of the borrower, because I think that there's a very rational strategy and there's some good sociological literature on poverty that talks about how people survive when they have a chronic deficit, essentially. And that obviously causes a lot of stress and distress. And one strategy is what you might call overconfidence, but it's not really overconfidence. It's just very short-term thinking. I'm just going to use this interim solution to deal with this current deficit that I have this month and not worry about the consequences. So there's a kind of overconfidence that discounts consequences that are just too painful and far away to think about when I'm just trying to survive from week to week. And I think it varies considerably with income. And I don't think of that as overconfidence, but it's still a kind of discounting that's probably not helpful for people.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask Professor Johnson, but the other panelists as well. In your presentation, you made reference, you used terms like safe, affordable, low cost, predatory, and rapacious. And I guess my question is, how do we define these terms? And the reason I ask is, you can read a newspaper article and it will refer to a high-cost loan, but that loan actually may be a low-cost loan. You make reference in your paper to the FDIC's small dollar lending program. For a loan of over $1,000, they may charge a $46 setup fee, and that sanctioned loan program, which it's not quite clear that it's profitable enough to be rolled out by others, although I think that's what they're trying to show, is actually more expensive than a refund anticipation loan in many cases. So there's this area where, I don't know, this middle zone, where, as we've heard, overdraft protection and so on, maybe actually higher costs for mainstream banks that we seem to be trying to encourage people to link up to than in some cases the fringe lenders. And is there a way to be more precise in deciding what is a predatory loan?
Okay, so that's a good question. So by predatory, I mean you've got the OCC, which is the prudential regulator for certain banks, has had advisory letters over the years actually saying what's predatory. It's in line with what the Center for Responsible Lending and other organizations have identified as predatory lending. Triple-digit interest rates, no assessment of the borrower's ability to repay, terms that are likely to lead the borrower to default. And so when you look at, some of the OCC advisory letters were not in the context of payday lending. They were just talking about what's considered a predatory loan. And then when you go and look at what is typical of a payday loan, you compare that to the OCC's list, which I see as conservative list, the payday loan still adds up as meeting the definition of a predatory loan. So, and so in that sense, I'm saying the CFPB doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. You've got regulators that have said what's predatory, and the payday loan meets the definition of what's predatory. And that's the starting point for issuing guidelines saying, hey, if you issue a loan with these types of terms, you follow these types of practices, then these are abusive, deceptive, and unfair and could subject you to enforcement action. So on the other side, I say, okay, safe, affordable, low cost, and I use the FDIC pilot program as the minimum of what should be considered a safe loan. And I disagree with your contention that the pilot program regarding profitability, the pilot program showed that the long-term consequences is that it's profitable. If you're thinking about it just in the short term, you could characterize these small dollar loans as not being profitable, but when the pilot program showed that long-term profitability, especially cross-linked with offering the consumer maybe an auto loan or mortgage, that is profitable in the long run. And I think when we think about getting consumers to use credit more responsibly, then that's what the big picture should be. How to get consumers into loan products that lead to asset accumulation, like a home, like a car, something that's going to lead to positive effects in the long run, not a position that sort of just looks at the now but in the end, the loan product has actually made the person worse off as opposed to better off.
What about rapacious, though? That's pretty
Okay, so in the
strange
paper,
language.
yeah, that is extreme language, but you look at all the examples that I put in there, and it's extreme what's going on. So when I said, I didn't say rapacious loans, I said rapacious debit access. And there's numerous stories out there, even the Department of Defense, when they put out their report on leading up to the passage of the Military Lending Act, they found that you had payday lenders who were debiting the bank account every 2 weeks, not to collect the entire loan, only to collect the rollover fee. And so, and that borrowers had to go and figure out how to stop that. In other words, the lender's saying, it's kind of like what's happening in the overdraft world. In the overdraft world, the banks are saying, oh, our consumers would rather us, charge them $35 for a $5 cup of coffee. And so payday lenders are saying, these online payday lenders in particular, they're saying, they're assuming, well, my consumer would rather me just debit a rollover of $30 or $90 every 2 weeks, and it never reduces the principal. And I'm saying that is a rapacious debit access, and no consumer who understood how they were going to access their bank account would have agreed to that. And when you look at the definition of what is deceptive, that's why I said the other paper, which is not a part of this project, you look at the FTC's definition of how do we decide something is deceptive, how do we decide something is unfair. This is classic unfair deceptive practices to use a person's bank account in a way to raid the bank account as opposed to trying to actually facilitate collection of the debt. Meaning to say, if there's enough money in the bank to pay off the loan in its entirety, pay off the loan in its entirety. Don't keep accessing the bank account every 2 weeks to take $90 out. And this Department of Defense report showed that the lenders who do this, the burden then is on the consumer to contact them up and figure out how to make it stop. And usually it can only stop if they figure out how to get that payment in to pay that debt that's still outstanding.
I take your point that it's very, I take your point that you don't like this practice, but I would encourage you to think carefully about using such inflammatory language. What you said about the words low cost and predatory, that had made a lot of sense about the baselines with which you're evaluating different types of loan products.
Well, what word would you use to describe the kind of debit access that I'm talking about?
Well, I wouldn't use rapacious, but...
Well, you can email. I'm not getting into argument with you. I'm saying you don't like my use of the word rapacious. I'm open to suggestions. I just don't want the reader to be led to believe that this is somehow something benign when it's really not. I'm not talking about how it used to be in the olden days when you actually went to a brick and mortar payday loan store. They got your paper check. They presented your check, and the consumer might get some fees. But it's not like the payday lender used your account in a way to keep getting rollover fees. And I'm very open to anybody in the room who has some other term that I should use, but I'm not going to gloss over the fact of what has been reported by the Department of Defense. That's why when you look at the Military Lending Act, it limits what a lender can do in terms of accessing the bank account. You can't access the bank account to get rollover fees. You cannot access the bank account if your APR rate is greater than 36%.
It's my privilege and burden to bring this session and the conference to a close. I think we should begin by thanking these panelists. I want to pick up a theme that I thought Chris Peterson drew out as well as anybody here, and that is how much we all are interdependent on establishing a conference like this, and we certainly have Mallory and Christine and others to thank. But there are also lots of people, lots of students and lots of staff that have played a huge role in this, and we're certainly appreciative for all of those persons who contributed, and we can't even know all of them. Probably you don't either, but thank you all very much, and we appreciate it. I'm going to speak for since I've been around here 38 years, for the faculty and staff and students at Washington Lee, and continue that theme of interdependence. You can't have a conference like this with a lot of wonderful participants who have been responsive to these folks when they cajole you to get your papers in on time and to come and to be part of this symposium. So thank you to those of you who have been participants. We are very appreciative from this institution, and you contribute to our continuing education. That's why we're here. So thank you for making a contribution to it. We're not going to let you stop in that regard. Some of my students on the undergraduate side presented earlier today a business plan for Community Financial Freedom, which is an organization that they've developed, and several people here were a part of that conversation, and they will be available tonight to talk to people, and I hope you'll be interested in what their work is. I know that you all have plans to continue to network with people beyond this time, and you can network with each other, and so I encourage you to continue that interdependent enterprise that we have. And in the end, what we're trying to do is we're worried about people who suffer from low income. David Shipler, in a book on poverty in America, points out how much it costs not to have money. And it's a very effective little chapter that explains that. And that's what we're interested in doing. And I'm glad you're involved in an enterprise. So thank you. I look forward to talking to people I haven't met this evening, and I know everybody else would like to meet everyone else. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate it very much.